Japan's next class of submarine was the 2,589 surfaced and 3,654 submerged ton I-15 class, or Otsu-Gata B1 type, or just B1 type. These entered service from September 1940 through July 1943, so during the war. I should point out that several started out with different numbers but were renumbered. This was because they were originally intended to be the odd numbers, while the midget subcarrying ones were to be the even numbers. Like their I-16 cousins, they were based on the I-7s, so fleet boats, except instead of carrying midget subs, they carried float planes for scouting and the occasional air raid. The aircraft were carried in a hangar forward of the sail in a knockdown condition. To launch, they had to assemble the plane, and then it could be launched off the catapult ahead of it. For the record, some sources say I-17's aircraft was carried aft and the gun forward, but I can't find any photos to confirm that, so if anyone can, let me know below. This was the most numerous Japanese submarine class actually built. Even more so if you include the I-40 and I-54 classes, which were sometimes considered continuations of the class, but I'm going to separate them. They were also arguably the most successful and arguably most active. I-26 firing arguably the first shot of the war. Then there's I-19, which probably fired the most successful torpedo spread in history. Of course, that could be due to their numbers. Generally, when and if people think of Imperial Japanese submarines, they think of these guys, or the I-400s, but we'll get to that later. There was the downsides. They were very large, so were relatively easy to detect, slow to dive, easy to track, and hard to maneuver. I hate to keep beating that drum, but there it is. It's inescapable that they were mechanically and technically inferior to Western subs. The Japanese knew this, so like the surface fleet, tried to brute force through it by building big. A questionable operational doctrine of trying to use them against fast, well-protected fleet units rather than targeting logistics along with committing them to supply runs didn't help. This, even as the U.S. industrial might steamrolled away, dooming them. Only one survived the war. I-15 was started January 25th, 1938 and completed September 30th, 1940. I-17 was started April 18th, 1938 and completed January 24th, 1941. I-19 was started March 15th, 1938 and completed April 28th, 1941. I-21 was started January 7th, 1939 and completed July 15th, 1941. I-23 was started December 8th, 1938 and completed September 27th, 1941. I-25 was started February 3rd, 1939 and completed October 31st, 1941. I-26, originally I-27, was started June 7th, 1939 and completed November 6th, 1941. I-27, originally I-29, was started July 5th, 1939 and completed February 24th, 1942. I-28, originally I-31, was started September 25th, 1939 and completed February 6th, 1942. I-29, originally I-33, was started September 20th, 1939 and completed February 20th, 1942. I-30, originally I-35, was started June 7th, 1939 and completed February 28th, 1942. I-31, originally I-37, was started December 6th, 1939 and completed May 30th, 1942. I-32, originally I-39, was started January 20th, 1940 and completed April 26th, 1942. I-33, originally I-41, was started February 21st, 1940 and completed June 10th, 1942. I-34, originally I-43, was started January 9th, 1941 and completed August 31st, 1942. I-35, originally I-45, was started September 2nd, 1940, and completed August 31st, 1942. I-36 was started December 4th, 1940, and completed September 20th, 1942. I-37 was started December 7th, 1940, and completed March 10th, 1943. I-38 was started June 19th, 1941, and completed January 31st, 1943. I-39 was started June 19th, 1941, and completed April 22nd, 1943. Main armament was 6 bow 533mm tubes for 17 torpedoes. A single open 140mm deck gun was mounted after the sail. Propulsion on the surface was provided by 2 diesel engines which produced 12,400 horsepower that ran the 2 propellers and recharged the batteries for a surface speed of 23 knots. While submerged, they used the batteries to power 2 motors which produced 2,000 horsepower for a top speed of 8 knots. Range on the surface was 14,000 nautical miles at 16 knots, and submerged they could do 96 nautical miles at 3 knots. Test diving depth was 100 meters. Built into the forward part of the sail was a hangar for a float plane, and the deck in front of it had a catapult. In November 1942, I-17 lost her deck gun to make room for supply barrels. In May of 1943, I-37 was fitted with Type 22 radar. In mid-January 1944, I-36 was fitted with Type 22 radar. In September 1944, I-36 landed her gun in favor of 4 Kaiten. In September 1944, I-37 had her hangar and deck gun removed to carry 4 Kaiten. In March 1945, I-36 had her hangar and catapults removed to fit 2 more Kaiten and Type 13 radar. I-15 started the war patrolling off Hawaii. In mid-December, she headed east to patrol off the U.S. West Coast, specifically San Francisco. Low on fuel and not finding any targets, she returned to Kwajalein in mid-January 1942. She was still there on February 1st when Enterprise's aircraft raided the harbor, but escaped damage by quickly diving. She then set out to find the carrier, but returned days later empty-handed. In early March, carrying extra fuel in her hangar, she moved to French frigate Shoals, where she acted as a refueling stop for the 2 seaplanes that carried out the March 5th second attack on Pearl Harbor before returning to January for an overhaul. With her upkeep completed, from mid-May through early July, she patrolled the Aleutians in support of the invasion, and then again returned to Japan. In mid-August, she headed south to patrol the Solomons and tried to interdict the American supplies to Guadalcanal. South of San Cristobal, in the pre-dawn hours of November 10, 1942, she was detected by the DMS Southard, and after 6 hours of depth charging was forced to the surface, where Southard sank her. I-17 started the war patrolling off Pearl Harbor. In mid-December, she sailed east and patrolled the U.S. West Coast off Eureka, California until mid-January 1942 when she put into Kwajalein for resupply. She was still there on February 1st when Enterprise's aircraft raided the harbor but escaped damage. However, she was unable to run down the carrier afterward and returned a couple days later. In mid-February, she headed east again to patrol off the California coast. On the evening of February 23rd, she sailed up the Santa Barbara Channel and shelled the Bankline oil refinery before slipping away to patrol up to Oregon. Getting low on supplies, she left the West Coast in mid-March and returned to Japan for refit. Ready for service again in mid-May, she sailed north to support the invasion of the Aleutians, where she received minor damage from an attempted depth charging and minor collision before returning to Japan in early July. In mid-August, she headed south and patrolled around Guadalcanal until late November, when she returned to Japan for a refit. Ready again at the start of January 1943, she returned to the South Pacific and ran supplies to first Guadalcanal and then New Guinea until the start of April. From mid-April till mid-May, she patrolled the Samoa-Fiji area, then returned to Truk. In mid-July, she was sent to patrol the Espiritu Santo Numoa area. On the afternoon of August 19th, 1943, southeast of Numoa, she was sunk by several depth charges carried by a Kingfisher float plane. I-19 was patrolling off Pearl Harbor at the start of the Pacific War. In the middle of the month, she moved to the west coast and patrolled off Santa Barbara until the end of the month, when she returned to Kwajalein, arriving in mid-January 1942. Like many of her sisters, she was still there on February 1st when Enterprise's aircraft raided the harbor, but escaped damage. She then set out to find the carrier, but returned days later empty-handed. In early March, with her hangar full of fuel, she moved to French frigate Shoal, where she acted as a refueling stop for the two seaplanes that carried out the March 5th second attack on Pearl Harbor before returning to Japan for an overhaul. With her upkeep completed in mid-May through early July, she patrolled the Aleutians in support of the invasion and then again returned to Japan. In mid-August, she headed south to patrol the Solomons and tried to interdict the American supplies to Guadalcanal. Southeast of Guadalcanal, on the late morning of September 15th, she spotted two task groups built around Wasp and Hornet operating close together. Stalking her targets, she fired all 6 bow torpedoes. 3 hit the close-by Wasp while she was cycling her aircraft and detonated her avgas tanks, mortally wounding the thinly armored carrier. The other 3 ran on to the further Hornet group, where one got pants yellowing close to Hornet, one hit and damaged the battleship North Carolina, and one hit the destroyer O'Brien, mortally wounding her. Probably the most successful torpedo spread in history. For I-19, however, it wasn't completely easy mode, as she spent hours running deep and dodging the counterattack of the destroyer Lansdowne before getting away and returning to Truk. Resupplied at Truk, she spent most of October and the first half of November again patrolling the New Caledonia area. From mid-November to mid-January 1943, she made several supply runs to Guadalcanal, then returned to Japan for an overhaul. With her yard work completed in mid-March, she returned to the South Pacific and patrolled the New Hebrides Fiji route until early September, when she wrapped up her patrol at Truk. In mid-October, she left Truk to try to catch the Wake Island raid, but couldn't catch up to them, so headed to Kwajalein for a new mission, to scout Hawaii. On the evening of November 15th, her scout plane overflew Pearl Harbor, but upon returning, there wasn't time to recover her due to an American float plane, so it had to be scuttled. Almost immediately after getting the pilots on board, she headed south to try to attack an American task force invading the Gilberts. 50 miles west of Macon, on the evening of November 25, 1943, she was detected by the destroyer Radford and sunk. I-21 was patrolling off Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. In the middle of the month, she moved to the west coast and patrolled off Santa Barbara until Christmas Eve, when she was spotted by a patrol plane which called in a patrol boat that damaged her rudder, sending her back to Japan for repairs. With repairs completed in mid-April, she headed south to patrol the Noumea area in support of the upcoming actions in the Coral Sea area. Following the Battle of the Coral Sea, she used her plane to scout Suva and Auckland for Enterprise and Hornet, which had been spotted in the area. In the pre-dawn hours of May 29th, her plane scouted Sydney for the upcoming midget sub-raid, and then she patrolled off Australia's eastern coast, even shelling Newcastle shipyard, until mid-July, when she returned to Japan for overhaul. With her overhaul completed, in mid-August she sailed south to patrol around the Solomons in support of the battle for Guadalcanal. In doing so, she spent the second half of December running supplies to Starvation Island. From the start of January 1943 through late February, she again patrolled off Australia's east coast and then returned to Japan for an overhaul. In the second half of May, she sailed to the Aleutians and patrolled there in support of the evacuation before returning to Japan. Next, in September, she sailed south to again patrol the Fiji New Hebrides route until mid-November, when she was redirected to intercept the American invasion of the Gilberts. Off Tarawa on the evening of November 29, 1943, she was bombed and sunk by an Avenger from the escort carrier Shenango. I-23 started the war essentially escorting Kido Butai, but soon broke off to patrol the Hawaiian Islands. In mid-December, she headed east to patrol the U.S. West Coast off Monterey Bay until late in the month, when she worked her way back to Kwajalein for resupply. She was there at the start of February 1942 when Enterprise's air group attacked the harbor and received only minor damage from the ship near her being hit in the raid, so soon afterward set sail to operate 200 miles south of Oahu, where she would act as a radio beacon for the second Pearl Harbor raid. After reported being on station in late February, she was never heard from again. Poof. Gone. Claimed by the abyss. I-25 was patrolling off Pearl Harbor on December 7th, and despite being spotted by a patrol plane in the middle of the month, headed east to patrol off Portland on the west coast until the end of the month. For the first couple weeks of January 1942, she returned to Hawaiian waters, but then put into Kwajalein for resupply and repair. She was still there on February 1st when Enterprise's aircraft raided the harbor, strafing her. In mid-February, she left port and headed out to patrol off Australia's east coast and around New Zealand, even using her aircraft to overfly Melbourne, Wellington, Auckland, and Fiji until putting into truck at the end of March and then heading to Japan for refit. With her refit completed in mid-May, she sailed to patrol the Aleutians until the end of the month when she headed south to again patrol off the U.S. West Coast. While off the mouth of the Columbia River on the evening of June 21st, she fired several shells inland, doing minor damage to a golf course. At the start of July, she returned to Alaskan waters for fears America would try to liberate the islands after the Battle of Midway, but when that didn't happen, she returned to Japan in the middle of the month. With her overhaul complete, in mid-August, she left Japan and headed east for the U.S. West Coast in an attempt to use her float plane to firebomb the forests of Oregon, arriving in early September. Throughout September, she tried several times, but while this time of year is usually dry, this year it was rainy, so she had no luck, only drawing the attention of several patrol planes that unsuccessfully attacked her. With that plan failing, in the first couple weeks of October, she resorted to the usual hunting tankers off the west coast before heading back to Japan, arriving late in the month. Along the way, she spotted 2 Soviet submarines sailing on the surface and sunk one. With her refit completed at the start of December, she headed south and joined the effort to run supplies from Rabaul to New Guinea until mid-January 1943. In the lower half of January, she patrolled south of Guadalcanal, trying to find the wounded Chicago and any ship trying to assist her, along with supporting the evacuation of Guadalcanal before returning to Truk. In February, she sailed south, and on the evening of February 16th, sent her plane to fly over Espiritu Santo before sailing back to Truk, arriving later in the month. After resupply and training, in late March, she began another series of patrols around Espiritu Santo. On August 23rd, she again sent her plane to reconnoiter the harbor. 2 days later, in the Coral Sea, on the evening of August 25th, 1943, she was detected by the destroyer Patterson and sunk. I-26 was off San Francisco in the pre-dawn hours of December 7th, 1941, with a steamship already in its crosshairs, time zones, awaiting the Tora 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 signal. When it came, she sunk the ship and headed north to patrol off Seattle until early January 1942, when she headed for Kwajalein to resupply. She was still there at the start of February when Enterprise's air group raided the harbor, and despite heading out, wasn't unable to catch up, so she returned to port. In late February, loaded with extra fuel tanks in her hangar, she headed to French frigate Shoal to act as a refueling stop for the 2 float planes that carried out the March 5th Second Pearl Harbor raid, after which she returned to Japan for overhaul. With her refit completed in mid-May, she spent the second half of the month patrolling the Aleutians before heading south to again patrol off the west coast for the month of June until returning to Japan at the end of the month. With her refit completed in mid-August, she headed south to patrol the Solomons area in support of the Guadalcanal campaign. On the morning of August 31st, she put a torpedo into Saratoga, sending the carrier back to Pearl Harbor for repairs, which took her out of the war for several critical months. Remaining in the area, on the morning of November 13th, she spotted the battered Task Group 67 and sunk the already heavily damaged Juno. Then, at the beginning of December, she returned to Japan for a refit. With her refit completed in mid-January 1943, she headed south and aided in the evacuation of Guadalcanal by first running supplies to the island, then patrolling south of it till mid-February when she put into Truk. At the start of March, she headed south from Truk and first helped rescue survivors of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea and took them to New Guinea, and then patrolled off Australia's east coast until mid-May when she resupplied at Truk. Starting in mid-June, her next patrol took her to the Fiji area until mid-August when she returned to Japan for an overhaul. With the backlogged port finally finishing her work at the start of December, she headed west and raided the Indian Ocean, including the Persian Gulf, along with landing Indian revolutionaries until mid-May 1944, when she again returned to Japan for upkeep. From mid-June to mid-July, she was fitted with a watertight container and ran supplies to the embattled Guam and then returned to Japan. With the American liberation of the Philippines underway, in mid-October, she left Japan to patrol east of Leyte and hopefully foil the landing. East of Leyte, in the aftermath of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, on the morning of October 26, 1944, she was probably detected by the destroyer escort Richard M. Roll and sunk by Hedgehog. I-27 finished her post-completion workup in mid-April 1942 and sailed south to patrol off Brisbane in support of the Battle of the Coral Sea until mid-May when she put into Truk. Quickly turned around, she soon left Truk, now sporting a midget sub, and headed south for Sydney. On the evening of May 31st, she sent her midget sub into Sydney Harbor, where it promptly got tangled in a net and the crew blew themselves up to avoid capture. Having lost its charge, the sub switched to patrolling off Australia's east coast until late June, when it worked its way back to Japan via Kwajalein, arriving in late July. With her overhaul completed in mid-August, she headed west to start a long series of patrols in the Indian Ocean, including the Bay of Bengal and the Persian Gulf area. Southwest of the Maldives, on the afternoon of February 12, 1944, she attacked a convoy whose escort included the destroyers Paladin and Petard. Sinking a ship, she herself was counterattacked and sunk by the two destroyers. I-28 finished her post-commissioning workup in mid-April 1942 and sailed to patrol south of the Solomons in support of the Battle of the Coral Sea until mid-May when she headed back to Truk. While approaching Truk on the morning of May 17, 1942, she was spotted and sunk by the submarine Tautog. I-29 finished her post-commissioning workup in mid-April 1942 and sailed to patrol off the east coast of Australia in support of invasion of the Solomons. On the morning of May 23rd, her scout plane flew over Sydney Harbor in preparation for the later midget sub attack. In early June, her plane again took off, but this time overflew Noumea. In mid-June, she wrapped up her patrol and returned to Japan via Kwajalein, arriving in mid-July. With her overhaul completed in late July, she left Japan and headed out for a series of patrols in the western Indian Ocean, including the Persian Gulf. In early April 1943, she left Penang loaded with cargo and southeast of Madagascar. On April 26th and 27th, rendezvoused with the German U-180 and swapped cargoes while at sea. Among the cargo was the Indian revolutionary Chandra Bose, which she took back to Sumatra. After resupplying while there, she again headed back to patrol the Indian Ocean until early August, when she returned to Japan. With the refit complete at the start of November, she loaded supplies and passengers before heading out on her next mission, a run to Lorient, France. When she arrived in March 11, 1944, after the usual ceremonies, meetings, etc., She loaded her return cargo, which included an engine for an ME-163 and a 262, along with their blueprints, a V-1 fuselage and its blueprints, and some uranium oxide, which you can use to make atomic bombs, and left port on April 16th for its return trip. In mid-July, she arrived at Singapore, where the scientists and blueprints were unloaded to fly to Japan, while she herself carried the cargo home. Homeward bound with her cargo, on the afternoon of July 26th, she entered the Luzon Strait, where she was found and sunk by the submarine Sawfish. I-30 completed post-completion workup in mid-April 1942 and was assigned the first Yanagi mission to Lorient, France. Along the way, she scouted the African east coast, including using her float plane to reconnoiter Diego Suarez ahead of the midget sub-attack the next night. When she arrived at Lorient on August 5th, there was music, dinners, flowers, meetings, you get it. Now loaded with German radar, torpedoes, fire control computers, and Enigma machines, she left Lorient on August 22nd for the return trip and arrived at Singapore on October 12th. That same evening, while leaving Singapore for Japan, she hit a mine and sunk. I-31 completed post-commissioning workup in mid-August 1942 and headed to patrol the Solomons as part of the massive fleet movement to repel the invasion of Guadalcanal, but later in the month, the new submarine suffered a hydraulic casualty and had to return to Truk for repairs. With that repaired, she returned to patrolling Guadalcanal until early October. After resupplying at Truk in mid-October, she sailed to patrol the Samoa-Fiji area, even using her plane to reconnoiter Suva and Pago Pago. From late November to late December, she made multiple supply runs from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, then returned to Japan for an overhaul, arriving in mid-January 1943. With her overhaul completed in late February, she headed north and began making supply runs to the garrison in the Aleutians. Northeast of Attu, on May 12, 1943, she found the American Liberation Force and attacked the battleship Pennsylvania, but missed. In return, the destroyers Farragut, Phelps, and Edwards counterattacked, forcing her to the surface, where Edwards sunk her with gunfire. I-32 completed her post-commissioning workup in mid-June 1942 and headed south to patrol off Australia's east coast and reconnoiter the New Caledonia area. In early August, she sailed around Australia's south coast up to Penang and then back to Truk, effectively circling the continent. At the end of September, she sailed to again patrol New Caledonia, but developed a leak in her fuel tanks, so ultimately had to return to Japan for repairs, arriving in mid-October. With repairs completed at the start of December, she left Japan again for the South Pacific, where she began running supplies from Rabaul to New Guinea until mid-January 1943. In late January, she patrolled south of Guadalcanal to cover the evacuation of the island until late February, when she returned to Truk. Unknown to her, even as she was putting into Truk, an ocean away in California, the destroyer escort Manlove was being started. The two had a destiny that only one would walk away from. After resupplying at Truk, in late March, she sailed to patrol the Fiji-Samoa area until early June, when she returned to Japan for overhaul, arriving in the middle of the month. With her overhaul completed, in late July, she left Japan, again heading to Rabaul, towing an Untitled supply container. From early September to mid-September, she used the floating container to run supplies from Rabaul to New Guinea and then switched to patrolling off Australia's east coast. In early November, she reconnoitered Pago Pago before returning to Japan late in December. With her overhaul completed in late February 1944, she left Japan, and after a stopover at Truk, she headed for the Marshalls to try to interdict the American invasion there. South of Wochi, in the pre-dawn hours of March 24, 1944, her path finally crossed the Manlove, and she was sunk. I-33 quickly too quickly in fact, completed her post-commissioning workup and left Japan in mid-August 1942 for the Solomons, where she patrolled south of Guadalcanal until late September when she put into Truk. While still at Truk on the morning of September 26, while trying to retrim the boat, the crew opened the rear main tanks, which dragged the boat down, drowning most of the crew on board. After several failed attempts, she was finally refloated at the end of December. Feeling confident with their patchwork, in early March 1943, she was finally towed back to Japan, arriving in the middle of the month to begin proper repairs. With repairs thought to be completed at the start of June 1944, she began trials off Kure. On the morning of June 13th, she attempted to dive, but unknown to anyone, a piece of wood had fallen into the air induction line to the engines, which prevented it from closing, and again she sunk to the bottom, drowning everyone in the aft sections. Of the 10 men in the control room, the captain remained behind. 2 got tangled in the cabling trying to swim to the surface, and 5 of those that did make it to the surface drowned of exhaustion. Of the 13 men in the forward section, 12 died of asphyxiation, and 1 just shot himself. Ouch! Post-war, the Hulk was raised and scrapped. I-34 completed post-commissioning workup in late November 1942 and headed to the Aleutians, where she mostly remained until late July 1943 when she returned to Japan. With her overhaul completed, in mid-October she was assigned to a Yanagi mission to France. The first leg of her trip took her to Singapore, where she arrived on October 22nd and began loading supplies bound for Germany. On the morning of November 11th, she left Singapore bound for Penang. South of Penang, on the morning of November 13th, 1943, warned by Ultra, the British submarine Taurus intercepted and sunk her. Post-war, she was salvaged and sold off for collectibles and scrap metal. I-35 completed post-commissioning workup in late November 1942 and headed to the Aleutians, where she patrolled and ran supplies. On May 15, 1943, among the usual foggy, lousy weather in the Aleutians, she tried to attack the American landing force at Attu, and for her effort was counterattacked and heavily damaged, sending her back to Japan for repairs, arriving in early June. With repairs completed in mid-September, she sailed for Truk and from there to patrol around Hawaii, but in mid-November was redirected to the Gilberts to try to break up the American invasion there. West of Tarawa, on the afternoon of November 23rd, she was forced to the surface by depth charges from the destroyer Meade, then rammed and sunk by the destroyer Fraser. I-36 completed her post-commissioning workup in mid-December 1942 and headed to the Solomons, where she made numerous supply runs to Guadalcanal until mid-January 1943, when she switched to running supplies to New Guinea until late February, when she returned to Japan for an overhaul. With her overhaul completed, she sailed south again in early April, but soon hit a typhoon which damaged her engines, sending her back to Japan for repairs. With repairs to her engines completed in early June, she headed north and ran supplies and did patrols around the Aleutians until early August, when she returned to Japan for an overhaul. In early September, she again left Japan with the audacious mission of reconnoitering Pearl Harbor with her scout plane. After dark, on the evening of October 16th, her scout plane took off, overflew Pearl Harbor, sent a radio report, and then never returned. Having given up on her plane's return, she sailed Canton Island on the evening of November 1st and then headed for Truk after refueling at Kwajalein, arriving in mid-November. In late December, she sailed to Rabaul, where she ran supplies to New Guinea until early January 1944, when she returned to Japan, arriving in the middle of the month. With repairs and refit completed, in late March, she sailed for the Marshalls to use her scout plane to reconnoiter Majuro. Despite successfully overflying the harbor on the evening of April 22nd, the plane had to be scuttled, and she herself was badly damaged, sending her back to Japan for repairs, where she arrived in early May. With repairs completed from mid-June to mid-July, she ran supplies from Japan to Truk and back. Now loaded with 4 chitin In early November, she set out to attack the U.S. forward base at Ulithi. In the pre-dawn hours of November 20th, she tried to launch her 4 Chiton. 2 were stuck in their mounts, another had a bad leak, and 1 actually managed to get off only to never be seen again. With her charges gone, she returned to Japan at the end of the month to prepare for the next wave. Again loaded with 4 Chiton, at the end of December, she left Japan and to take another shot at Ulithi. In the pre-dawn hours of January 12, 1945, she launched all 4 Chiton. 1, as so often happened, disappeared. 1 was spotted by a patrol plane and bombed. 1 damaged the ammunition ship Mazama, and 1 managed to sink the infantry landing ship LCI 600. Afterward, she returned to Japan to celebrate her success and reload. Now with 6 Chiton, in mid-April she left Japan to attack the Okinawa invasion force. On the morning of April 27th, she sighted a convoy, and while 2 of her Chiton broke down, the other 4 took off, only to miss everything. Afterward, she returned to Japan for more Chiton. Reloaded with 6 more Chiton, at the beginning of June, she sailed to patrol the Saipan Truk route as her next patrol. Northeast of Truk, on the morning of June 28th, she spotted the supply ship Antares and launched a Chiton at her, only for Antares to evade and hit the Chiton with one of her 3-inch guns. Antares then fired her stern 5-inch gun at the sub and called for help, which was answered by the nearby destroyer her Sproston, which began laying depth charges. In an act of desperation, 2 more Chiton were launched at the destroyer, one of which disappeared and the other was blasted by the destroyer. Sproston then went on to roll further depth charges, which badly damaged the sub, and while she managed to escape, she had to return to Japan, arriving in early July. Repair work had mostly been abandoned when the war ended, and wait, she survived? She survived! We found one that actually survived! She was pretty beat up and was scuttled off Goto Island the next year, but she actually survived! I-37 finished post-completion workup in May 1943 and sailed for the first of several patrols in the western Indian Ocean, including the Persian Gulf, where they committed several war crimes by machine gunning survivors. On October 11th, she used her scout plane to reconnoiter Diego Suarez. On November 17th, her plane reconnoitered Kilindini Harbor. On March 15, 1944, she again used her plane to reconnoiter Diego Suarez. On April 7th, her plane overflew Mombasa. On the morning of April 27th, as she was leaving Penang, she got close enough to a mine to detonate it, damaging her ballast tanks, which sent her to Singapore and eventually Japan for repairs, arriving in early September. With repairs completed and now carrying 4 Chiton, in early November, she left Japan and headed for Palau to attack the American anchorage at Ulithi. Just outside Ulithi Harbor, on the afternoon of November 19, 1944, she was found and sunk by the destroyer escorts Conklin and McCoy Reynolds. I-38 completed post-commissioning training in early May 1943 and headed south, where from late May until late June, she made several supply runs from Rabaul to New Guinea and back. In the first half of July, she patrolled Kula Gulf, where she had a close run-in with the destroyer Waller, but managed to escape with minimal damage before returning to Rabaul. From mid-July to mid-August, she again ran supplies from Rabaul to New Guinea and back. In the later half of August and first half of September, she ran supplies to Kalimanjaro and back to Rabaul. From late September to mid-December, she did several more supply runs to New Guinea from Rabaul and back, and then returned to Japan for overhaul. With her overhaul completed in mid-March 1944, she headed back south and made several more supply runs from Truk to New Guinea and back until late April, when she returned to Japan. Again ready in mid-May, she sailed to reconnoiter the Marshalls, but in transit was redirected to scout Majuro instead. On her way there, in mid-June, she was redirected to the Marianas to try to intercept the American landings there, but when that proved too hot, she was recalled to Japan, arriving in mid-July. in mid-October, with the Leyte Islands she headed there, but was redirected to scout Ulithi in the Palaus ahead of the upcoming Khitan attack. East of Palau, on the evening of November 13th, 1944, she was detected and sunk by the destroyer Nicholas. I-39 completed post-commissioning work up in late July 1943 and sailed south to patrol the Espiritu Santo area. On September 12th, she sunk the tug Navajo, only to be damaged herself a few days later, which sent her to Truk for repairs. By the way, if you're ever bored, do a deep dive into the history of the fleet tug Navajo. She was one of those ships that was constantly in the background or just out of frame. Anyway, with repairs completed in late November, she left Truk and sailed to interdict the American invasion of the Gilberts. Southwest of Tarawa, on the evening of November 26, 1943, she was found and sunk by the destroyer Boyd.